Good morning, everyone. Welcome to More Than Pixels. This is a very important topic here at CES, especially this year. We've been talking about it for a couple of years, but it's finally come to fruition. And I'm very happy to be here with a panel of distinguished guests, one of whom will be here shortly. But in the meantime, let me introduce those who are here. To my immediate left is Dan Shinazi, Senior Manager of TV Product Planning at Samsung. And then we have Pat Griffiths, Vice President, Office of the CTO of Dolby Labs. And finally, Hanno Bassi, CTO of 20th Century Fox Film and the President and Chairman of the UHD Alliance. My name is Scott Wilkinson. I am the editor of avsforum.com and the host of the Home Theater Geeks podcast on Twit TV. So we're going to start with Pat, who's going to come up here and show us give us a little bit of context for the discussion that we're about to have. Pat?
Thanks, Scott, and good morning, everybody. So since the subject today is about high dynamic range, we thought it's important to at least set some context and give you a little bit of background. So I'm going to try to do that. And if you're familiar with it, please bear with us for those who may not be. So as we think about next generation imaging, one of the ways I've characterized it for technical as well as non-technical people is really three ways to make a better picture. More pixels, I think we all kind of get that. HD is 2 million pixels. 4K is actually 8 million pixels. And our friends at NHK who are pushing an 8K format, that's actually 32 million pixels. And we get it. The more pixels you have, the greater the spatial resolution. But let me actually get into this. As we also think about the future, our ideal goal is to represent reality. And ideally would be like looking out a window. And whether we're doing the news or trying to tell a story, getting closer and closer to the reality that we see with our eyes every day is one of the technical challenges we've been working on. And we've made a lot of improvements. We're still not quite there. So how do we get there? First, as I mentioned, is higher spatial resolution, more pixels. 2 megapixels for HD, 8 megapixels for 4K, 32 megapixels for 8K. And indeed, the more pixels we have, we finally get to the point where our eye can't perceive any more resolution. So, and we're actually kind of getting there today with where we are. But that's only one of the factors. Once we have motion, which is pretty important in entertainment, and we do something like pan a camera, you'll notice you'll get motion blur. How do you fix that? You send more pictures per unit time. The more pictures per unit time, we think of as faster pixels. And all of these go back and forth in terms of data rates. As you have more spatial resolution, takes more megabits per second to send that information. If you double the frame rate, you double the number of pixels per second. But the last and most important topic for today's discussion is how about making every one of those pixels better, no matter how many we have or how fast we're sending them. And by better, for today's discussion, we mean things like brighter whites, blacker blacks, brighter colors within the available palette, and of course the holy grail for us as engineers, getting closer and closer to reproducing all the colors we as human beings have seen for 1 million years. So let's focus a little bit on that topic of better pixels. And there's a couple of context points that we're now beginning to socialize much more frequently as we go forward. The first one is, well, how do we measure them? And a key unit of measurement, you've probably heard a lot. We euphemistically and lovingly call it nits. But actually, the technical term is candela per meter squared. And the important thing I wanted to share with this audience is it is a measure of light the way the human eye perceives it. So it's weighted by our human eye light sensitivity curve. And many people don't realize this. So the way the eye sees the light in this room is different than the way a camera might see it. So important thing about a nit, it's the way we see light. The next thing, and this is actually kind of a new concept, or we're rediscovering something that's been there forever, but in the historical world of television, we've forgotten about the fact that peak brightness in our palette can change. This is the famous diagram. You'll see that horseshoe, And this is a mathematical way of representing all the colors we as human beings can see with an XY coordinate system. And you see there the classic triangle that represents what's called the recommendation 709, which defines the color primaries of CRTs, cathode ray tubes. Anyone bought one of those recently? It's been around for over 70 years. But that technology in its day was the way we could reproduce color. By adding a little bit of red, green, and blue, we could make white that you see in the center. And in fact, when we talk about 709 and the classic rule of 100 nits of peak white, that's the way television is produced, that's the way it's been delivered, and that's the way televisions were designed going back to the 60s to reproduce those colors. And we've done it so long, we forgot about the fact that actually that color coordinate system, that palette, not all colors are created equal. White is always the brightest color. Why? Because it's the sum of red, green, and blue. Blue itself, as you see in the diagram on the right, is actually only 10% of peak white. So we only have 10 nits to reproduce a world of blue, which is in the 100,000s to millions of nits in a sunny sky. And the key point I want you to look at here is, if you were looking down from the top in that diagram on the far left, there you see white. But if you actually kind of look at it in a three-dimensional perspective where we can see all the relative intensities of the colors in the palette, it looks more like a volume. And in fact, we're now beginning to talk about that term, a color volume, which is specified by the color primaries and then the peak white, usually at D6500, which is the color of white of sunlight. And by the way, white can vary all over the place, but D65 is the color typically used in Hollywood for making movies. So if we look at that slightly differently, where we actually let the coordinate system kind of go back into the screen on the far right, and then just look at luminance going from 0 to, say, 100 nits, it's kind of the way we try to visualize a color volume. And I explain to people, you kind of think of it as a pyramid. And inside that pyramid are all the allowable colors, combinations that you can reproduce. And this is the best way of thinking about when we talk about high dynamic range, and you hear people say, well, high dynamic range is only about luminance, but it's also about color, and it's also about more colors. Well, when you think of it in terms of a color volume, it defines the palette in both luminance and color. So one of the things I want you to leave with today is we now know how to measure light, and we now know how to define all the palette of colors. So, why do we care? Why are we going back and re-examining, that decision of 50+ years ago? Which, by the way, is 100 nits max white for television and only 48 nits max white for cinema. And the reason for that goes back to the days of film and when the standards were designed over 100 years ago. We no longer use film. So it's a good time to re-examine some of those assumptions. So why have a larger color volume? Well, here's an example. You see on the far right, volcano, very, very bright, intense oranges and yellows. And in a typical scenario, if you were to try to capture that real-world color with the palette that we have today, you might find, well, that pixel's so bright and orange, I can't reproduce it at the intensity I actually saw it. So you'd have to make some decision. Do I make it not as bright? Do I actually shift it to fit it into that color palette? Well, the other way to solve the problem is if I actually have a larger color volume, in this example, a color volume that actually has a peak that's 10 times higher, or 1,000 nits, versus the 100 nits, now I might be able to reproduce that pixel and represent reality, getting us closer to the goal. And so that's now the new horse race. And we found in research that's been done that we as human beings, if we weren't limited by technology and can choose what we're comfortable in seeing in the real world, closer to what we've been doing for 1,000,000 years, we would actually like to have a peak color volume of 10,000 nits, or 100 times more than we are doing today. And when you're able to do that, you begin to see all the exciting things you probably have seen here on the floor. We're able to have better contrast and better colors, contrast in colors. And that's what a lot of the debate is about. To close and kind of put it all in context, this is a matte lab rendering of a color volume. The green that you see there And this is kind of in a log scale in luminance. So the green represents the container, the color volume, real-world color volume. And what you're seeing in the red and blue is an actual image. The image is that HD 2-megapixel image on the right there of the car with the fellow in it. And what I wanted to point out is, you'll notice in the old SDR world, most of the pixels, many of the pixels are fine. We didn't need to really fix them. And those might be some of the ones in the black and the gray. But you'll notice there are a number of pixels. And by the way, just to be clear, all 2 million pixels in that image on the right are plotted in their appropriate place in that color volume rendering. This is what makes this pretty cool, and it helps clarify the concept for many people. So if I went to another image, the swarm of pixels would be moving up and down and around inside that color volume. And that's kind of the reality of where we are today. And the bigger we make the color volume, the more creative latitude we have to tell our story. So to close, you'll notice the pixels in red, some of those, the ones that go way up to the top in white, if you look at the car, you'll notice there's some chrome and some speculars from sunlight hitting the car. A noonday sun is about 1.6 billion nits. Anything it hits gets very bright. And we as human beings have lived and dealt with that for 1 million years. And now with our technology, we're able to begin to reproduce that. So to close, kind of the takeaways, NIT, the way we measure light based on how we see it. A color volume is a kind of the new way of thinking about HDR. It combines both the elements of higher contrast and color into one useful element. And hopefully that'll set some of the context for the discussion. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Pat. We have our, oh, whoops, sorry, hit some button there. We now have our fourth panelist with us, Joe Kane, founder and president of Joe Kane Productions. Glad to have you with us. Thank you very much. Next up, I'd like Hanno Bassi to tell us a little bit about the announcement that was made at this show by the UHD Alliance, of which he is the president and chairman, which addresses many of the points that Pat made. The problem that we've had up till now is that there hasn't been a clear definition of what do we mean by better pixels, and what are the standards that we are going to use moving forward into the world of Ultra HD. Hanno, give us a little summary, if you would, please.
Yeah, so first of all, thank you, Pat, for this illuminating presentation. Really nice and concise, very good. That kind of indeed describes a little bit the problem that we were trying to resolve, which is there's obviously the ideal space that we would like to cover, which is, you know, the analogy Pat used to look through a window, and then the actual physical reality, and especially in terms of display capabilities. As you can tell with this color volume that's shown here, there's quite a few parameters that need to be defined. And this time last year at CES, the discussions had just started around, okay, how do we propagate high dynamic range and other, you know, the wider color gamut. So it's a combination of the contrast and the color space, as Pat described. How do you actually propagate that into the consumer space and create consumer products and come up with a consistent experience? So, because when all these discussions started, everybody had their own idea of what they meant, what color space they wanted to cover, what contrast range they wanted to cover, what peak brightness, and so on and so forth. And so because of that, the UHD Alliance was formed, and now we have like 35 representatives of all the major consumer electronics companies are there, all the Hollywood studios are there, major technology companies like Dolby, Technicolor, distributors like DirecTV, Netflix, Amazon, so on, Sky Europe, they're all part of the alliance. And what we've done actually is we've come up with a set of quality or performance parameters for displays. So we've said performance criteria for peak brightness, black level, and resulting, you know, contrast ratio. Another thing we haven't talked about yet here is the actual electro-optical transfer function of the TV, which takes an electrical signal and turns it into light. We also have a definition for that, and you know, precision parameters to follow that. So we have a pretty good set of technical specifications for the display, but we didn't stop there. What we also did was we also created a content mastering specification plus a set of guidelines that matches pretty much these display requirements. And in order to kind of communicate that fact to the consumer, we created a logo. It's called Ultra HD Premium. And that logo can be put on displays that meet the performance criteria. And in order to get the logo that way, they have to go through a certification and compliance testing program. And at the same time, you can also put that same logo on content. So for example, 20th Century Fox, we will start releasing Ultra HD Blu-ray discs in the next month. You know, the Samsung is coming out with a player in the United States. Here we'll have content. Other studios actually will have content as well. And that Ultra HD Blu-ray will also carry the Ultra HD Premium logo. So as a consumer, you can look at, you see the logo on that disc, you see the logo on the display, you put the two together and you get a fascinating, you know, top-notch, guaranteed experience. And the one thing I need to say also is that we believe this is probably the first time where really the content industry and the consumer electronics and the technology industry came together and actually talked about, okay, if we create this content over here, what is it actually going to look like on the display that you guys make? And so we're actually really happy that we were able to come to an agreement there. That's kind of the 2-minute version.
It's very exciting to me.
3 minutes.
Sorry, Pat, you had something to add?
No.
Oh, you're good? Okay. Dan, give us the manufacturer's perspective. Hanno is with the studios and also with the Ultra HD Alliance, but you know, he's coming at it from the content creator's point of view. What about from the display manufacturer's point of view?
Sure. So Samsung were huge proponents of 4K, 4K HDR, wide color gamut, all of these attributes that really make a more immersive display.
Mm-hmm. In fact, Samsung is one of the founding members of the UHD Alliance, are they not?
We are, yes, we are. Yeah, we're very proud of that. You know, if you rewind the clock, 2014, you first saw the first wave of 4K TVs, and this was just about resolution. And resolution is fine if you have a very large display or if you sit very close to it, you can enjoy the benefits of that. But now with television, it's much more than just resolution. It's the wide color gamut and the high dynamic range, and this adds a lot to immersion. It also adds a lot of perspective. We naturally see things with our own eyes with high dynamic range. It's when we see an explosion, when we see a reflection off something from the sunlight. This is how the producer. I'm not the expert on Hollywood, but I'll defer that to Hanno. But the producers intend when they photograph something or video, take a movie. That's how they see it. That's how they envision it. And our goal and the goal of the UHD Alliance is to faithfully reproduce that image.
Mm-hmm. Now, Joe, you've been working with manufacturers and studios, I think, as well, about with all of this in mind. One of the challenges that I see, and I'd love for you to address this, is the fact that with standard dynamic range, with what we've had up to now with HD TV, the performance characteristics of the content and the display were well defined. And thanks to the UHD Alliance, they are becoming more well defined for Ultra HD, but still, different TVs now have different performance characteristics. Some may reach 1,000 nits peak brightness. OLEDs don't. They only reach maybe 400 or 500 at this point. So how are we going to deal with, and some have different color volume capabilities. How are we going to deal with that?
The best answer I can give you, the simplest answer I can give you is we have dealt with, as much as we've had a standard to work with, we've dealt with differences in everything that manufacturers have brought out today. Now, one of the things that I see about UHD is that it is an opportunity to go back and look at all of these specifications all over again. I actually, in my world, I want to see UHD take over for HD. There were things that there are goals that are going on in UHD now that would have been ideal to have started in the transition from standard definition to high definition. And now, of course, the CRT has gone completely, so we have no reason to stay with those specifications in any way, shape, or form. We now have an ability to take advantage of the newer technologies and all the things they're capable of doing. Incidentally, they're capable of doing the color volume that Pat has so well set out in his diagrams. So as much as there is going to be a disparity in the technologies, there has always been a disparity in what the technologies can do. I actually see UHD as an opportunity to accommodate these disparities. As an example, we can do high dynamic range, we can color grade it for 4,000 nits, yet we can put out specifications in the data stream that will allow it to be well produced on a 1,000 nit monitor. So I believe that as much as there's going to be differences in technology, in display technology, I actually believe that UHD can accommodate those differences, and they can accommodate those differences in metadata by identifying what they are and how they were created. And then the TV set manufacturer, if it can't do 4,000 nits in the display, can understand that there's a way of properly displaying that signal in the 1,000 nit set. So I actually believe that the UHD system is going to accommodate the differences that you're going to see in manufacturers, and that everybody's actually going to get a much better picture because we now have the flexibility of accommodating one system versus another.
Mm-hmm. The word that you said that I think is so critically important is metadata, right? That along with the video and audio information that's coming in the signal, there's also this metadata, which indicates how the content was mastered and created. And then the TV has its information about what it can do. You know, can I do 1,000 nits? Can I do 2,000 nits? What kind of color volume can I do? And coordinate with that metadata coming in from the content, from the UHD Blu-ray or the stream or whatever, and match itself to that data as much as possible. Which brings me to the next topic that will be, oh, I'm sorry, Pat, yeah.
Yeah. So this is an appropriate point to amplify that a little bit of
Sure,
what Joe
please.
said. And we already do have standards in place. Going back a couple of years, there's an organization called the Society of Motion Picture and Television Engineers that works closely with Hollywood and broadcasters. And in preparation for these transitions, we realized with this brave new world of all these varying color volumes on the mastering side, it's important that we capture that information and send it along to the point about metadata. And I never metadata I didn't like. But in SMPTE, we created a standard that now defines the mastering environment, what were the color primaries, because they're going to be a whole new world of different choices, what was the mastering color volume, so to speak, and send that information along with the content. That helps inform the downstream devices in a way that we couldn't do before. Mm-hmm. In addition, we realized that now that we're getting closer to the limits of the human visual system for entertainment purposes, you know, we agreed on a set of parameters. Actually, all the studios were involved on what's our aspirational goal for peak white. And I mentioned in my presentation, we found from consumer research 10,000 nits, actually 20,000 nits was the 90th percentile. We talked about that for a while. We said, we don't even know how to do 10,000 today, so we'll use that as a goal. We created a standard that now defines the EOTF, as Hanno mentioned, which is converting light code values to light output, and defined it according to the right target, which is the human eye, and taking the work of agreed color science work. We now defined a new curve that is called PQ. That's a SMPTE standard. That's actually the basis of some of the things we do in the UHD Alliance. And to Joe's last point about being able to map from the mastering color volume to a target display, There's work in SMPTE right now to define a standard for carrying that information, the scene-based information, that helps do a better job of mapping. So the good news for this audience is, while this is a brave new world, we're already well on our way to standards, as well as some, logo confidence programs.
Yeah, Joe.
I'd like to add another point that I think is important in our heritage in moving into this. Digital cinema has had a lot to do with showing us that we can make the move into this world. In the digital cinema world, we can measure a projector, we can see what it's capable of doing in red, green, and blue, and we can input those parameters into the projector. And then whatever's coming down the line, we can calculate the difference from what the projector is capable of doing to what is needed to be done in order to get a good picture. I did this in a projector that I put on the market, where the calibration process is literally measuring the red, green, and blue and entering that data into the projector. Well, the red, green, and blue that the projector is doing is not what we want to do in the system. But we know what we want to do in the system, and the metadata is going to tell us all the new things that we want to do. All we have to do is calculate the difference from where we are to where we need to be. So the technology to do what we need to do to make this system work has been around, has been in use, and fully functional since, what, about 2003?
Digital cinema, you mean?
In digital displays.
Yeah.
So if you're worried about this as a brave new world, no, it's not. We've had lots of experience doing this. And so one of the beautiful things that I like about this new system is manufacturers are going to come up with different capabilities. All we have to do is know what they're doing and know where they're supposed to be in order to accommodate the signal that's coming down the line and calculate the difference. And that means that we're going to leave production with a whole bunch of wide open capabilities. As an example, we're now color correcting to something called P3, the color space of digital cinema. We're not using the full 2020 spectrum. We're putting P3 in the 2020 container, but we can literally define that what we're doing is P3, and we can tell the display that it needs to calculate what it needs to do from its native capability to get to P3. And so I see this as a phenomenal new world where there can be much more uniformity than there has ever been in the past.
Mm-hmm. I'm really excited by the fact that what we're talking about today is really future-proofing. You know, we went from SD, standard definition, to high definition, and yet we kept the same colors, we kept the same dynamic range, and now we have to do that again. And I think we would all agree we don't really want to do that yet again, right? So if we define something big enough, and I think Pat made this point, something that encompasses everything that the human eye can see, and why go beyond that? There's no reason to. And then scale that down as necessary to the display, then in the future, when companies like Dan's, Samsung, come up with better displays, which of course they always will, then that same content will be able to be adapted and reused and made even better with those capabilities. Dan, what do you think?
Yeah, oh, absolutely. It reminds me of the Ultra HD Blu-ray. You brought up the exact point. Is the container of the color is in 2020. It's a much larger container than even P3. Is it future looking? Absolutely. I think there's very few, if any, displays on the market today that can produce anything close to 2020. But the idea is, or the concept of Ultra HD Blu-rays is this very large container. You can master in P3. And then that will be transformed. That signal will be transformed through an EOTF and properly displayed on displays. Mm-hmm. So I think we're sort of intermixing two technologies here: the wide color gamut and also the high dynamic range, and they're interrelated. And that's sort of Pat did a good job at explaining that.
Hanno, as a member of the content creation community, your studio, 20th Century Fox, and others then need to make sure that when you create the content, it encompasses as wide a range as possible, right?
I actually wouldn't characterize it that way.
Oh, okay.
Because that goes against the creative freedom.
Ah,
so
please elaborate.
So it's kind of the other way around. It's what we're telling our artists is, look, we're giving you a much bigger canvas and a much wider palette of colors than you've ever had access to. Have at it, right? Do whatever you want to do with it, and there is creative freedom. So, for example, if you look at a title like if I can pronounce this correctly, the artist or l'artiste or whatever it was called, the black and white, silent movie,
sure. Yeah.
a few years ago, won Best Picture, I think even. I mean,
Yes.
that is an expression of creative intent, and
In black and white.
in black and white, but you can clearly do that in high dynamic range, for example, right? So that's just one of the examples where we're just saying, guys, here's a bigger volume. I mean, I think the color volume concept here really shows this. Look how much more you can do, and I got to say that. Our creatives haven't been excited about a new technology like this in years, this constantly gets compared, by the way, with higher frame rate. Remember, there was one studio with one movie that, three movies, I guess, three parts of one movie, came out in a higher frame rate, and the artists did not really appreciate that. They didn't really go for it, but when you have discussions with them, they say, well, high frame rate, we don't know, but high dynamic range, that's the thing. And because there are things that they clearly could not, always wanted to do, but could not do. So we spend a lot of time with colorists and directors of photography and directors in our coloring suites and looked at the differences, what they can do on HD Blu-ray today, or actually in the theatrical grade, and what they can do in high dynamic range. And the high dynamic range specification in the high dynamic range monitors are actually the widest array of possibilities that are out there today. And like Pat was saying, especially blue is a huge issue. There's a lot of Blu-rays where we can't really replicate the blue of the sky because that particular part of the sky is too bright for it to be still blue. And now if you're within the Ultra HD Premium specification, you can actually make the sky blue at very high brightness levels. And when our artists see this for the first time, we show that to them, they're just blown away because they can actually do something that they were never able to do before.
Yeah.
So I don't want to go on here further, but so we're all really excited about this. But it's really, we're giving them a bigger workspace. That's what we're doing.
Joe?
You mentioned high frame rates. I'd like to point out to the audience that there is a wonderful tutorial on high frame rates on a website called Pickfair Institute.
Oh, yes.
Pickfair
John
Institute.
Erland, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. There's a phenomenal tutorial on the importance of considering higher frame rates. Well, traditionally, there's going to be a lot of people who will still want to work in the 24 frame rate because that is their prerogative, that is their artistic intent. There is a case being made for having a new high frame rate of 120 hertz to accommodate anything anybody wants to do, including variable frame rate. And if you go to pickfairinstitute.com, you're going to find an absolutely wonderful tutorial on high frame rates.
Another good advocate of high frame rate is Douglas Trumbull, who's been working on this for a very long time. And I recently interviewed him on my podcast, Home Theater Geeks. So I encourage you to go check that out too, because he had some really, really interesting things to say about it. Did you have something, Dan?
No.
Oh, you're good? Okay. One thing I wanted to bring up and have all of you discuss is we're talking about high dynamic range, which is really the sort of the difference between black and white. And for many years it's been this, now it's this. But in order to convey that from Ultra HD Blu-ray or streaming or so on, it needs to be encoded in a certain way. And there are more than one ways to do that, just like I suppose there's more than one way to skin a cat. The two biggest names that you will hear are Dolby Vision, which is being used in commercial cinemas now and also in consumer displays at home. And what's called an open standard HDR10, that's the sort of colloquial name for it. I know it's not the technical name, but they both use a certain EOTF, electro-optical transfer function, which, as Hanno and Pat both said, determines how the code values, the digital values in the signal, get translated into how much light comes out. And now that we have much more light coming out, and we have these two primary different systems. And so I'd like for you guys to talk about how can they coexist. As in the audio realm, I know you guys are you'll have a lot to say about it. In the audio realm, we have Dolby Digital, we have DTS, we have several different formats, and they all coexist very nicely. And I'd like to know how these high dynamic range systems will coexist.
Well, I don't know if Pat's going to agree, but I actually don't think that they're totally different and mutually exclusive. So the way I look at it actually is, if you look at the Ultra HD Blu-ray standard that came out last year, there is a mandatory portion of the standard, which is if you do high dynamic range, you have to support a version that's HDR10. All the players need to be able to support it, and it's mandatory in the specification. If you choose to do Dolby, and it's PQ, so so all the relevant, there's a lot of things that are, so all the fundamental parts of HDR in there are in HDR10. The EOTF and the metadata that describe that this is actually HDR, peak brightness, all that. Then if you want to, you can actually enhance that experience further with a proprietary method like Dolby Vision, and the Blu-ray spec actually allows there's several others like a Technicolor solution, a Philips solution, and but they're not mutually exclusive. So I can, as Fox, we can publish a Dolby Vision disc, and it's going to play in every Blu-ray player, and it's going to be is going to show you an HDR experience on any HDR TV. There's just a matter of, okay, there's maybe a further enhancement that can be obtained by a proprietary solution, and that's the choice of the player maker, it's the choice of the display maker, and it's a choice of the content provider. But if any one of these three doesn't make that choice, there's still a totally fulfilling experience. So it's not like it's not going to work all of a sudden.
Right.
I don't know, Pat, if you want to change.
I know
that.
Pat's got something to say about this.
Well, no, I think you said it. They're not mutually exclusive. The Blu-ray spec, which Dolby helped develop, in fact, with the help of the studios, we were, as many know, I mean, we were big believers in HDR and brought it on the scene 2 years ago and worked on promoting it within the Blu-ray spec. So the mandatory HDR base layer is 10-bit precision. It includes static metadata that defines some of the attributes of the content. The Dolby Vision extension, which is compatible, as Hanno was saying, extends that precision to 12 bits, which is what we agreed with the studios when we were first designing a container that would work in every possible case of content, including not only natural content, as in camera acquired, but also CGI, which has zero noise. And so 12-bit precision was needed to guarantee you wouldn't get errors. So Dolby Vision, by definition, guarantees that 12-bit precision. In addition, the Dolby Vision extension does a lot of things. Because we master content in Dolby Vision, we send a lot of information dynamically, back to the metadata point, dynamic metadata that defines scene-to-scene variations in the content, which helps a Dolby Vision-enabled TV actually do a better job of rendering artistic intent, which we're passionate about. So to the point here, at least in the PQ world, Dolby Vision naturally sits right on top of HDR10. Now, there's a raging debate about EOTFs these days, which I guess, I don't know if you want to get into now, but for now,
not deeply, but
at least in this world, yes, we're on the same page. They're complementary solutions.
both HDR10 and Dolby Vision use the same EOTF called PQ for perceptual quantizer.
Right.
Joe, you had some points.
Yes, and Pat, I'd like to have you confirm this, but if there are Dolby Vision exclusive titles out there, Dolby Vision plans on set-top boxes that will allow the conversion of that to a standard HDR10 display.
Well, I'd put it this way. Dolby Vision is a superset of all the formats out there. So Dolby Vision-enabled TVs will play back HDR10 as well as Dolby Vision. A television or set-top box that receives a Dolby Vision content, a lot depends on what the manufacturer has chosen to do. So it's not for me to speak about what Samsung does.
Okay, no, I'm not trying to speak for what Samsung does. I'm actually reading press releases that have said that Dolby is going to be creating set-top boxes, and I'm asking you to confirm that, but I've read press releases where there will be set-top boxes for Dolby Vision exclusive content so that it can be played on sets that don't have Dolby Vision capability.
I'm not sure which press releases you're referring to, but maybe just to clarify, Dolby is in our implementations, and we don't build set-top boxes, as you know, but we do provide ingredient technology. Many of the major SoC vendors in the world will be implementing the technology, and the solution we're proposing for those vendors is basically to implement the Dolby Vision technology in a way that will play back Dolby Vision streams, it will play back HDR10 streams, it will play back either dual layer approaches, which there are some use cases for, OTT, we don't need to go into that, and also play back a non-backwards compatible single stream. So our implementations, when people use it, will be able to play back all of those combinations.
Right, so maybe just to reconfirm what we're kind of saying, because there's controversy on this topic, but there shouldn't actually be any. I want to be very clear about this. So if to go back to the Blu-ray example, which is the one that we've already got, agreed upon and it's going into the market, but there's no reason why one couldn't make a set-top box in the same way, or actually make a TV in the same way, which is, people will make Blu-ray players that support Dolby Vision and others that don't support Dolby Vision, maybe support something else. The disc will play regardless. It will always play, right? It's just a matter of, do you want the enhancement from 10-bit to 12 bits? But 10 bits gives you a pretty good experience. You want, if you have like a very large screen, top notch, then maybe you want to go to 12 bits, and that's all this is. We're just, it's an enhancement on top of like what I would call the base layer. So HDR10 is the base layer, and Dolby Vision and other things are enhancements of that. So it'll play. So if you have a player that does Dolby Vision but your TV doesn't, the TV will display HDR10. It's going to be a great experience. Most of the HDR that you're seeing out there on the show floor, by the way, is HDR10, and so you can judge for yourself whether that's an acceptable experience or not. So I would actually want to move on from this topic at some point, because it's a controversy that shouldn't be there.
Okay. Dan, did you want to weigh in on this, particularly since you're with the Blu-ray Disc Association as well?
Right. So I mean, Hano's spot on. At least in the Ultra HD Blu-ray, the standard, the distribution, there's no controversy at all. The disc will play just fine with Open HDR, with optional HDR such as Dolby Vision or Philips or Technicolor's implementation. It's manufacturer's choice which one they want to read off the disc and display. Samsung's of the belief that the HDR10 will deliver phenomenal imagery. I think we've proven that out on the show floor. If you've had a chance to look at our displays, I guess moving off this topic, but there's other distribution channels, I guess, where this gets sensitive, and those haven't been worked out yet. But certainly on Ultra HD Blu-ray, it's a non-issue.
Okay, good. Well, I wanted you guys to address the issue because, as you say, it is a controversy that exists out there, and perhaps it shouldn't. And I'm glad to get some clarity on that. We have a question in the back of the room.
That's actually correct. Dolby Vision, when we did the design, supports a lot of profiles. You know, we're codec agnostic, so you know, in the Blu-ray case, we do HEVC. As Hanno mentioned, that's a 10-bit PQ base layer, and Dolby Vision works on top of that. In the OTT world, because 99.9% of the content out there is SDR at 100 nits, 709 primaries, 420 gamma-based sampling, our OTT partners are saying that's what they want as a base layer, and that's 8 bits. The Dolby Vision enhancement layer converts that to PQ, full 12 bits, provides dynamic metadata, and then a Dolby Vision-enabled TV gives you the full 12-bit Dolby Vision experience. A legacy TV ignores that and gives you an SDR. So that's backwards compatibility for an SDR world. You know, we're having a growing number of HDR-capable sets. In that case, you know, Dolby Vision, the base layer would be to HDR10, and as discussed here, that plays back. But if you want that extra capability to do Dolby Vision, it works on that as well. Does that make sense? For the next generation Blu-ray disc, it's this HDR10 PQ, right?
And I think part of the reason for that is because we didn't want there to be multiple versions of the same disc out there, and so we did it that way. But if you're a streaming provider, and you know, several of them have been very public about this. I mean, if you, let's say, pick Netflix, for example, and I know they've talked about this multiple times here at the show and elsewhere, that's why I can say this, I think. They can, you know, if they've implemented their Netflix app on an HDR10 TV, their head-end is going to deliver HDR10. If it's on a Dolby Vision-enabled TV, okay, then they can choose to serve up Dolby Vision to that app. So again, there's no controversy here. It's a choice of the display manufacturer fundamentally, what quality level they want to provide, and that's that. That's all there is to it. It's actually simple. I can see how this is a little bit confusing to consumers, but the underlying technology actually is fine. There's no issue.
Any other questions out there? I've got a couple more of my own, but I'd like to give people an opportunity. If not, I'm wondering, and Dan, you might be able to address this, others as well, how will displays, modern displays, deal with high dynamic range content and standard dynamic range content, which will coexist for some time now? I mean, as I think it was Pat pointed out, most of the streaming, OTT, over-the-top content is still mastered and delivered in that format. Still plenty of TV shows and so on, and people will still have Blu-rays in their collection. You know, they'll eventually replace them with Ultra HD Blu-ray, I'm sure, but for a while these two things will coexist. How will the displays deal with that?
So I think the question is really dependent on the source. So if it's SDR material, I guess it's really not an issue. If you have an Ultra HD Blu-ray player and you want to connect that to say a 4K TV from another company, not ours, but and that TV cannot produce HDR imagery, then the player will have to volume remap that to the best of its ability. So there is intelligence in the player to actually color volume map to the expected dynamics of the television.
And by remapping, I just want to make sure everyone understands that the content may have this kind of color volume, but the display can only do this, and the player needs to be able to scale it, if you will.
Yeah, Scott, if I could
please
just add something to this, which is, if you look at the work that the UHD Alliance has done, the first phase was really focused on motion picture and scripted television content that gets pre-mastered in an offline
very good point
workflow.
Yes,
where the SDR versus HDR compatibility really becomes an urgent issue is on broadcast, and especially if you're looking at a variety channel where you're mixing sports and news and movies and all that, or actually simpler things like you're interrupting a movie with advertising. There this becomes a little bit more complex, and in the UHD Alliance, we're actually going now into a new phase where we're starting to come up with a content specification for broadcast, live broadcast content, and
we don't have that yet, I guess. That's not finished.
No, we don't have that. Those discussions are just starting. And by the way, it's not just the UHD Alliance. It's ATSC, DVB, the ITU. You name them. There's like 5, 6, 7, 10 different organizations that are all debating that topic and trying to figure out how to make that work. It's a little bit more involved.
Yeah, I'm sure. Yeah. Joe first, then Pat.
I'd like to point out that the industry is actually interested in learning what they know or don't know. So that, as an example, Sky, the satellite provider in Europe, had a plug fest in Berlin just a few weeks ago now. And I was asked to come in and help do the testing. And among the things that we did is we provided an ability to signal on the HDMI line whether something was high dynamic range or standard dynamic range, and had an opportunity to see if the set would respond to the two. In other words, do one thing with standard dynamic range and do something else with high dynamic range, which of course is what's necessary. So manufacturers actually have an opportunity to have their equipment tested by the UHDA Alliance, because the UHDA Alliance is going to test for those things. But someone who isn't, even manufacturers who aren't part of the UHDA, have had opportunities in PlugFest. There's another one coming up in April. So it's an opportunity for these manufacturers to get input from the larger world. In other words, this is what's being broadcast, what can you do with it? And it's an opportunity for them to find out for themselves what happens when the Blu-ray player does one thing or another. And Dolby did participate in that PlugFest, is in the process of providing signals. So the best I want to give you the assurance that the industry is doing things. Both the UHD Alliance and other organizations are going out of their way to ensure that this system works.
That's very good. Pat, go ahead.
Transitions are painful. We went through this before. I think Connor and I were there, Joe as well, in '96 when we went from the world of SD to HD. You remember all that? And aspect ratio from 4:3 to 16:9.
Mm-hmm. A lot of SD material being played on
SD material
on
and
HD
interstitials
sets.
and all that.
Yeah.
So here we are again, only it's SDR to HDR. So the good news is, you know, we've been there, we understand some of the problems, and we're working on a lot of the issues. And the good news this time is with digital technology and the help of metadata, we can do a lot more. And a lot of it's going to come down to things we take for granted in the computer world. Remember when you had to actually load a printer driver and hope your printer actually knew what it was getting? We don't worry about that anymore because the printers talk to our computers. And increasingly with some of the technical standards over HDMI like E did, we have our TVs talking to the set-top boxes and to the content itself. So the solutions just need to be worked out. There's no fundamental technical challenges. But to the specific question, you know, if I'm in a HDR-enabled display, the display, its color volume is going to define my best presentation experience. So if I get content that's not up to that, there are things called inverse tone mapping that will try to scale it up. It's much like vivid mode on TV sets today, except it's a reverse. The TVs are better than the content. And so the TVs say, well, I'm going to stretch this content, which my friends in Hollywood don't generally like, but it does that. In this case, if the content is not as good as the TV, it's kind of vivid mode revisited only in the world of HDR. Yeah. So you're going to see a lot of gyrations, but we'll get there. The good news is the baseline is so much better, so yeah. Hopefully it'll be all goodness.
One last question right here. Your question is about HLG?
Yeah, so okay. I'll explain.
Hybrid log gamma, which is yet another EOTF. Pat,
well, it's actually the same old EOTF. It's gamma on steroids, or I call it the wounded knee gamma. Because the idea is, gamma served us well, and if we can just kind of stretch it up a little bit, we'll get all the benefits of backwards compatibility and yet kind of ease our way into the high dynamic range world. And it's an engineering compromise, much like fractional frame rate or interlace was way back when in the early days of television. So it does solve one set of problems, but at a price. There's a compromise in both the HDR, and there's big questions about how much backwards compatibility you really get at what benefit. I think many of us believe that we're actually at a watershed moment in history where we have the opportunity to move actually to a new technology direction. Many of us believe in PQ because it's consistent, it represents the human visual model, and it's future-proof for the next 50 years. But business is business, and so there's a lot of interest in seeing if HLG can work.
So, yeah, I just wanted to...
One quick, we're running out of time here.
Just soften this a little bit. So that's a discussion that's ongoing, what the role of HLG is, and like Pat was saying, it has some benefits, especially in terms of backwards compatibility, but they do come, with some baggage as well. So that's a discussion that we are continuing to have. It's actually not an easy and quick answer. It's not possible because there are compromises on on this side here, and I think so HLG is trying to solve a problem that really exists. It's a real problem and a big problem. I think the problem with HLG I see primarily is that we have 2 EOTFs instead of just 1. And if you're trying to define a broadcast television system, and you're having interstitials and alternating with content, you don't necessarily want to have to go from PQ to HLG all the time. And we're also not sure that television sets actually will be able to do that because we would have to switch from one frame to the next, from one EOTF to another. That problem is now on top of the SDR versus HDR issue. So I'm looking forward to those debates. It'll be interesting. There's no answer today.
Unfortunately, we've run out of time. I think all of you will agree that, with me, as I feel, that this is a very exciting time. That this transition really has reached a tipping point, in my opinion, beyond pixel resolution, spatial resolution, as Pat mentioned at the beginning, to encompass these other areas that are really going to take our viewing experience to the next level. I want to thank my panelists, Hanno Bassi, Pat Griffiths, Joe Kane, and Dan Shinazi for enlightening us greatly in this hour. Thank you so much.